The whole town laughed when he tried to grow food in the dead of winter, and now they know why. A broke veteran moved to the edge of a frozen mountain town with nothing but a worn red and black flannel jacket, a half-empty toolbox, and a loyal German shepherd who never left his side. While everyone else stocked canned food and prayed the power wouldn't fail, he built something that looked completely insane. A tiny greenhouse in the snow. Neighbors called it a joke, a waste of time, a plastic coffin for plants. But then the blizzard hit, whiteout wines, roads sealed shut, shelves emptied, and the town went quiet in a way that felt hungry. And when his dog started pawing at the greenhouse door, whining like it could smell hope itself, the veteran stepped inside and found something no one believed was possible. Fresh, green vegetables in January. What happened next would shock the entire town and turn their cruel laughter into desperate knocking at his door. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below because it's always wild seeing how far these winter survival stories travel. Winter lowered its white curtain over the town, and the wind moved through the pines like an old god clearing his throat. Frank Miller lived where the plowed road stopped pretending it cared, at the ragged edge of the forest, in a small cabin that looked as if it had been carved out of stubbornness rather than lumber. He was 70, but not the kind of 70 that sits politely in a rocking chair and tells warm stories. His shoulders were still broad beneath years of weather and work, his hands thick with calluses that never truly healed, and his face was cut into hard angles, cheekbones sharp as broken stone, a jaw that looked like it had argued with life and refused to lose. A gray beard shadowed his mouth and chin, always there even when he shaved, and his eyes, pale, tired blue, held that distant look men carry when they've seen too much noise and learned to live in silence. The thick red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket never left him. It hung on his frame like armor from another era, the kind you didn't buy for style but for survival. People in town joked that the jacket had more miles on it than the county snowplow, and Frank didn't correct them. He had learned that words were expensive, and he'd spent most of his life paying for them in ways he didn't want to remember. Shadow was the only one who followed him without judgment. The German shepherd was 5 years old, large and muscular, with a dense black and tan coat built for winter, and eyes so intelligent they sometimes made Frank feel exposed, like the dog could read the parts of him he kept hidden. Shadow walked close, not clingy, just loyal in the quiet way that said, "I'm here, and I'll still be here when the world turns mean." His ears stayed alert even when he lay down, and his nose was always working, tasting the air for danger or dinner or both. Frank talked to Shadow more than he talked to people, and it wasn't because Frank was lonely in the sentimental sense. It was because Shadow never asked questions Frank couldn't answer. He never demanded a smile. He never asked Frank to be anyone but what he was, a man trying to survive the season without losing the last pieces of himself. Frank hadn't come to this town because it was charming. He came because it was cheap, forgotten, and far enough away from the life that had chewed him up and spat him out. The war had left him with a spine that ached in the cold, and a mind that refused to sleep when the wind rattled the windows too hard. After he came home, he tried to be normal the way people try on a coat that doesn't fit. Uncomfortable, forced, and never convincing. He worked construction for decades, building other people's homes while his own life stayed half-built. A marriage collapsed under the weight of unspoken things. A son moved away and called less and less, not out of cruelty, but out of that quiet drifting that happens when people don't know how to stand near pain without catching it. Frank didn't blame anyone. Blame was another kind of noise. He just kept moving, job to job, town to town, until his knees started warning him that time was winning. When he bought the cabin, the realtor smiled too hard, like she was selling him a story instead of a structure. The price was low enough to feel like a trick, but Frank knew why. Winters here didn't play fair. They didn't just arrive. They hunted. The kind of cold that didn't simply chill your skin, but reached inside your lungs and tried to take ownership of your breath. Frank had lived through worse than weather, but he respected winter the way you respect a large animal, because pretending it isn't dangerous is how people get killed. The first weeks, he kept to himself. He split wood until his shoulders burned, repaired the cabin's drafty seams, and stacked supplies like a man building a wall against fate. Shadow helped in his own way, circling the yard like a patrol dog, occasionally barking at the tree line as if warning the forest not to try anything foolish. The town, meanwhile, watched from a distance. In a small place, everyone notices the newcomer, especially the kind who doesn't try to charm his way in. Frank wasn't rude. He just didn't perform. He nodded when spoken to, paid in cash when he could, and left before conversations could become obligations. The first person who truly approached him was Sarah Caldwell. She owned the small general store on Main Street, the kind of place that still smelled like flour, coffee, and old wood, where the bell above the door announced every arrival like a tiny church chime. Sarah was in her early 40s, tall and lean, with a posture that made her look both tired and unbreakable. Her hair is chestnut brown, usually tied back in a messy knot that suggested she had better things to do than impress anyone. Her skin was pale with a dusting of freckles across her nose, and her eyes were a steady hazel that didn't flinch easily. She spoke with a calm voice that carried the authority of someone who'd learned to keep her temper on a short leash, not because she lacked fire, but because she'd spent too many years putting out other people's fires. Frank noticed the faint scar near her left eyebrow, a thin line that hinted at a past accident she didn't feel like explaining. She looked at Shadow first, crouched slightly, and let the dog sniff her hand before she looked up at Frank. "New out on Ridge Road," she said, not as a question. "You're Frank." Frank nodded. "And you're Sarah." She smiled, just a small one. People talk, especially when they're bored and cold. Frank almost laughed, but it came out as a breath through his nose. Sarah's humor wasn't flashy. It was the kind that kept you alive in a hard place. She slid a small paper bag across the counter toward him. Dog treats. The good kind, not the cheap crumbs. "For Shadow," she said. "He looks like he's earned them." Shadow sat politely, but his tail thumped once against the floor like a drumbeat of approval. Frank paid, and as he turned to leave, Sarah added, "If you need anything before the storm gets worse, don't wait until you're desperate. Pride freezes faster than pipes." Frank paused. He didn't turn around right away. That sentence landed in him like a pebble thrown into deep water. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, and left before gratitude could make him feel exposed. The storm Sarah mentioned wasn't a single event. It was a season-long threat. Each morning the sky looked like it was deciding whether to punish the town or simply ignore it. The snow came in waves, sometimes soft and pretty, sometimes sharp as grit, driven sideways by wind that howled like it was laughing at human plans. Frank watched the weather like a man reading an enemy's face. He didn't just look at the forecast. He listened to the trees. He measured the way the cold pressed against the cabin walls. He studied the sun's weak arc, that thin winter light that barely seemed committed to showing up at all. That was when the idea came, quietly, stubbornly, like a seed refusing to die. A greenhouse, not a fancy one, not the kind you saw in glossy magazines with citrus trees and polished tile floors. Frank wasn't trying to impress anyone. He was trying to solve a problem. Every winter, the town's fresh food vanished first. Trucks couldn't always get through. Shelves emptied. People lived on canned soup and whatever they could stretch. Frank had done enough hard years to know that hunger doesn't always come as a dramatic collapse. Sometimes it comes as slow weakness, bad decisions, and the kind of hopelessness that makes people turn on each other. So he started building. He cleared a patch of ground beside the cabin where the wind hit less directly. He drove stakes into frozen earth until his hands went numb. He hauled salvaged wood from an abandoned shed down the road, boards warped but still usable if you knew how to argue with them. He found old transparent panels at a junkyard 2 towns over, scratched but intact, and strapped them to the truck like stolen treasure. Shadow trotted alongside him the whole time, occasionally stealing a glove and forcing Frank to chase him in circles, as if the dog understood that laughter was another kind of warmth. When Frank began raising the frame, that's when the town started paying attention. Not because they cared about him, but because people love watching something they don't understand. Curiosity is just gossip wearing a cleaner shirt. The first laughter came from Tom Briggs, a thick-necked man in his 50s who ran a small mechanic shop and carried himself like the mayor of common sense. Tom had a belly that suggested he enjoyed his own cooking, and a beard that was more patchy than rugged. But he spoke with the confidence of a man who'd never once apologized for being wrong. He pulled up in his truck one afternoon while Frank was fitting panels into place. Tom leaned out the window, smirking like he'd caught Frank doing something embarrassing. "Hey, soldier," Tom called, loud enough for the wind to carry it. "You building a fish tank for squirrels?" Frank didn't look up. He kept working, his gloved hands steady. "Greenhouse," he said. Tom laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "In this weather? You planning to grow bananas next?" Shadow lifted his head and gave one low warning woof, not aggressive, just a reminder that the dog was listening. Tom raised his hands theatrically. "Easy, boy, I'm just saying. Snow's gonna bury that thing by Christmas." Frank finally turned his face toward Tom. His eyes were calm, but there was iron behind them. "Then I'll dig it out." Tom stared a moment, like he wasn't sure if Frank was joking. Then he chuckled again and drove off, shaking his head as if he'd just witnessed a harmless tragedy. More people came, not all at once. They arrived like crows, one at a time, pretending they weren't interested. A couple of teenagers stopped by on their way home from school, faces red from cold, laughing behind their scarves. An older woman walking her small terrier paused and squinted at the structure like it offended her personally. Even Sarah drove by once, slower than necessary, her gaze flicking over the greenhouse frame. She didn't laugh. She just looked thoughtful, like she was watching a man place a bet against winter itself. Frank heard the jokes. He heard the whispers. He felt the eyes on his back. And if he was honest, it stung more than he wanted to admit. Not because he needed their approval, but because ridicule has a way of waking up old memories. In the war, there were moments when people laughed too dark laughter, the kind that came right before something terrible happened. In his marriage, there had been laughter too, but it had changed over time, turning sharp, turning cruel, turning into a weapon. Frank had learned to survive many things, but humiliation always carried a special poison. It tried to make you small. He refused to be small. At night, When the cabin was quiet, Frank lay in bed and listened to the wind scrape the roof. Shadow slept at the foot of the bed, heavy and warm, occasionally twitching in dreams. Frank's mind wandered into old places, faces he hadn't seen in decades, voices that had faded into echoes. He remembered the look on his son's face the last time they argued, that mix of disappointment and confusion, as if the boy couldn't understand why his father was always somewhere else even when he was standing right there. Frank swallowed hard in the dark, feeling the weight of that memory like a stone on his chest. He told himself he wasn't building a greenhouse to prove anything. He was building it because it made sense, because it was practical, because he was tired of living like the world could take everything and you were supposed to smile and accept it. But deeper than that, he knew the truth. He was building it because he needed to believe in something that grew, something that didn't die just because the air turned cruel. The next morning, the sky was a flat, merciless gray. The cold had teeth. Frank stepped outside, his breath turning to smoke, and Shadow bounded ahead, paws crunching in the snow. The greenhouse frame stood there, skeletal but proud, like the ribs of a creature waiting to be given life. Frank ran a hand along the wood, feeling the stiffness of it, the promise of it. He could almost hear the town's laughter in the wind, but he also heard something else beneath it, something quieter, more dangerous. Hunger. Not yet, not fully, but coming. The season was young, and winter was only just beginning to show its true face. Frank tightened his jacket, the red and black plaid bright against the white world like a stubborn heartbeat. He picked up his tools, nodded once at Shadow, and went back to work as if he were building more than a greenhouse, as if he were building a vow. The next morning, the town woke up under a sky so pale it looked unfinished, like winter had run out of ink and decided white was enough. Frank Miller stepped outside before the sun had fully committed to showing itself, the cold biting his cheeks and pulling at his lungs with the rude confidence of something that believed it owned the world. The greenhouse frame stood beside the cabin like a stubborn skeleton, half-built and unapologetic, its rough boards and mismatched panels giving it the look of a thing assembled by willpower more than design. Frank liked it that way. Pretty things attracted attention, and attention in a small town came with teeth. Shadow trotted ahead through the snow, his black and tan coat thick as a winter blanket, paws punching neat holes in the powder as if he was signing his name across the yard. The dog's ears flicked at every sound distant crows, the creak of a tree, the faint groan of the cabin settling, while Frank carried a bundle of salvaged lumber on his shoulder and tried not to think about how much his joints complained with every step. Pain was a kind of weather, too. It arrived whether you invited it or not. He had spent most of his life building things for other people. He knew how to read materials the way some men read faces. Good wood had a certain weight, a certain smell, a grain that told you whether it would hold or betray you. The boards he'd scavenged were warped and scarred, but Frank didn't see damage. He saw history. He saw potential. He set them down, measured twice, and began fastening them into place, his movements slow but exact, like a ritual. Every nail he drove was a small act of defiance against the town's laughter. Not loud defiance, Frank didn't have the energy for theatrical anger. It was the quiet kind, the kind that grows roots. By midday, the wind picked up, swirling snow around the cabin in nervous spirals. Frank paused to sip coffee from a dented thermos, watching the air as if it were a living thing. He knew storms had personalities. Some were blunt and violent. Others were sly, creeping in with a gentle face before turning cruel. This one felt impatient. Shadow stood beside him, head tilted, nose twitching toward the tree line, as if he could smell the mood of the sky. Frank reached down and scratched behind the dog's ear, and Shadow leaned into it with a soft grunt, his tail wagging once. Frank almost smiled. Almost. He went back to work, lifting the first of the transparent panels into place. They were old, scratched, and clouded in spots, but when he angled them toward the weak winter light, they caught it like a promise. The panel made a soft plastic creak as he secured it, and for a moment, the greenhouse looked less like a pile of scraps and more like an idea taking shape. Frank stepped back, squinting, imagining the finished structure. A small chamber of warmth beside the cabin, a pocket of summer trapped in winter's fist. The thought made something in his chest loosen, just slightly, like a belt unbuckled after a long day. He wasn't the only one watching. Across the road, at the edge of a neighbor's property, Tom Briggs appeared again, leaning on his fence with the posture of a man who believed the world existed to entertain him. Tom's beard looked even patchier in the daylight, and his cheeks were red from cold and from the satisfaction of having an audience. He had the kind of face that could smile without warmth, a grin sharpened by years of being the loudest voice in a room. Frank didn't hate him. Hate required attention, and Frank was careful with his attention. But Tom represented something Frank had spent his whole life avoiding: the easy cruelty of people who never had to carry heavy memories. Tom called out, "You're really doing it, huh?" His voice was half amusement, half disbelief, like he was watching a man try to teach a rock to dance. Frank kept his hands on the panel, steadying it. "Looks that way." Tom chuckled. "You got a heater in there? Or you planning to breathe on the plants all night?" Shadow's head lifted, eyes locking onto Tom. The dog didn't bark this time. He just stared, silent and sharp, like a guard deciding whether someone belonged on the property. Tom noticed and raised his hands again, jokingly surrendering. All right, I'm going." But he didn't leave immediately. His gaze lingered on the greenhouse, and for a second, his laughter thinned into something else: curiosity, maybe, or the uncomfortable feeling of watching someone do what you'd never dare to try. Frank waited until Tom walked away before he let his shoulders relax. He hated how much the man's presence tightened something inside him. It reminded him of younger days, of barracks laughter, of men teasing each other to avoid admitting they were afraid. It reminded him of how fear always found a costume, and humor was one of its favorites. That afternoon, Sarah Caldwell came by, not to mock, not to applaud, but to see with her own eyes what the town was already chewing on in its conversations. She parked her old station wagon at the edge of Frank's driveway, the tires crunching over the packed snow. She stepped out, wearing a long, dark coat and thick gloves, her chestnut hair tucked into a knit cap, a few loose strands escaping like rebellious thoughts. Her face looked wind-chapped but determined, freckles faint beneath the winter redness. She walked carefully, boots sinking slightly, and Shadow met her halfway with a cautious wag. Sarah crouched again, letting Shadow sniff her hand, and the dog accepted her with the quiet dignity of a creature who knew the difference between danger and mere noise. "I figured I'd see the famous project," Sarah said, standing up and brushing snow from her knees. Her tone carried humor, but it wasn't cruel. It was the kind of humor that said, "Life is ridiculous, so we might as well admit it." Frank wiped his hands on his jeans. "Not much to see yet." Sarah's eyes moved over the structure. She didn't look at it like a joke. She looked at it like a puzzle. It's going to hold, she said, more statement than question. You're anchoring it deeper than most people would. Frank nodded once. Wind doesn't care about optimism. Sarah laughed softly. No, it doesn't. Then her expression shifted, becoming more serious. People are talking, Frank. They think you're, well, they think you're trying to prove something. Frank glanced away toward the trees. Let them think. Sarah studied him for a moment, and Frank could feel her gaze like sunlight on ice, gentle but revealing. You don't have to prove anything, she said quietly. But if you're doing this because you're scared of what winter does to people, you're not wrong. That landed harder than Frank expected. He looked back at her, and for a second, his face softened. Not into friendliness exactly, but into recognition. Sarah wasn't just a shop owner. She was someone who'd watched winters take things from people. Money, health, pride, sometimes life. She carried that knowledge in her steady eyes. I'm doing it because I'm tired, Frank admitted, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Tired of watching the same problems repeat. Sarah nodded as if she understood more than he'd said. Then keep going, she replied. Just don't let their laughter crawl under your skin. It's not worth the space it takes up. Shadow pressed his shoulder lightly against Frank's leg, as if agreeing. Frank reached down and ruffled the dog's fur. The warmth of the animal, solid and alive, steadied him. After Sarah left, Frank worked until his hands felt like wood themselves. He secured more panels, sealed gaps with strips of rubber he'd scavenged from old tires, and packed snow around the base to block drafts. He built the door from two mismatched frames, reinforcing it with extra bracing because he knew a weak door was an invitation to winter. The work was exhausting, but it carried a strange satisfaction. Every improvement made the greenhouse feel less fragile, less like a foolish dream. It began to look like something that belonged there, like it had always been meant to stand beside the cabin. As evening fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The sky turned the color of bruised steel, and the wind sharpened into something almost angry. Frank stepped inside the greenhouse for the first time with the panels mostly in place. The air inside was still cold, but it was different, less biting, less aggressive. The walls softened the wind's assault. The space felt like a held breath. Frank stood there, listening. Outside, the world hissed and moaned. Inside, there was a quiet that felt unnatural in the best way. He could almost imagine warmth living here someday, like a small animal curling up in a corner. Shadow followed him in and sniffed the ground, then looked up at Frank with those steady eyes. The dog's expression wasn't mystical, but it felt like approval. Like Shadow was saying, "This might work." Frank's throat tightened unexpectedly. He swallowed, embarrassed by the emotion. He wasn't a man who cried easily. But there was something about the greenhouse, this awkward, patched-together shelter, that made him feel like he was building more than a structure. He was building a second chance, not for the town, not for anyone else, but for the part of himself that had gone numb over the years. He left the greenhouse and went back to the cabin to prepare the next step. He had seeds, simple ones, hardy greens that could tolerate low light. He had soil he'd hauled in sacks, mixed with compost he'd been quietly making since autumn. Like a man hiding a secret, he had a plan. Imperfect, but real. Frank set the supplies near the stove, and as the fire crackled, he felt the faintest flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Anticipation. Later that night, as Frank lay in bed, The wind hammered the cabin walls. Shadow slept on the floor, breathing slow and steady. Frank stared at the ceiling, listening to the storm like it was an old enemy circling outside. His mind tried to drag him back into old memories, shouts, darkness, the metallic taste of fear. But Frank held on to the image of the greenhouse instead, the panels catching light, the stillness inside, the idea of green life pushing up through soil while the world outside froze. He understood something then, with a clarity that surprised him. The town's laughter wasn't really about the greenhouse. It was about the fact that Frank had dared to hope in a season designed to crush hope. People didn't like being reminded of what they'd given up on. It made them uncomfortable. It made them defensive. So they laughed, because laughter was easier than admitting they were afraid. Frank turned his head and looked down at Shadow, the dog's chest rising and falling. "We're going to make it," Frank whispered, not sure if he meant the greenhouse or his own heart. Shadow didn't wake, but his tail thumped once against the floor, as if he heard the promise anyway. The next day would bring more cold, more eyes, more jokes. But tonight, Frank let himself believe that something clumsy and homemade could still be miraculous. Not because it was perfect, but because it existed at all. The cold arrived like an insult, sudden and personal, as if winter had finally grown tired of being polite. Overnight, the town's familiar white landscape turned sharper, harder, the snow crusting over into a brittle shell that cracked under boots like thin ice on a grave. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, threading itself through the streets and between houses with the hunger of something searching for weakness. Frank Miller woke before dawn to the sound of the cabin's boards groaning, a slow complaint under pressure. And for a moment, he lay still, listening, letting his mind measure the storm the way his hands measured lumber. Shadow was already awake, standing at the window with his ears up and his body tense, his thick black and tan coat bristling slightly as if he could feel the temperature falling through the glass. When Frank swung his legs off the bed, pain flashed through his knees like a warning flare, but he pushed it aside. The cold didn't care about aches. The cold didn't negotiate. Outside, the air hit him like a slap. His breath turned instantly into a cloud, and the inside of his nose stung as if the world was trying to freeze him from the inside out. He wore his red and black buffalo plaid flannel jacket over layers, the fabric stiff with old memories and newer frost. Shadow bounded ahead into the yard, but even the dog's movement was different today, less playful, more purposeful, like a soldier on patrol. Frank's greenhouse stood beside the cabin, now fully enclosed, its scratched panels dusted with snow, the door rimmed with ice. It looked fragile against the cruelty of the morning, like a glass lantern in a storm, and Frank felt an almost irrational surge of protectiveness toward it. He walked to it slowly, testing each step, then pulled the door open with a firm tug. The hinges creaked. The air inside was not warm, not yet, but it was calmer. The wind's teeth didn't reach as deep in there. It felt like stepping into a pocket of mercy. Frank had prepared the soil the night before, mixing it with compost and old leaves he'd stored like treasure. He had chosen hardy greens, kale, spinach, arugula plants that didn't demand luxury, only persistence. He knelt on the cold ground, hands working carefully as he pressed seeds into the soil. Shadow watched from the doorway, head slightly lowered, as if guarding the ritual. Frank didn't pray. He had never been good at praying. But his hands moved with the same seriousness as prayer, and maybe that was enough. When he finished, He covered the seed beds lightly and placed dark stones along the edges, not for decoration, but because stone held heat longer than wood and plastic. It was a small advantage, the kind that mattered when the world turned hostile. The first sign of trouble in town came before noon. Frank drove into Main Street for supplies, the truck's tires grinding over ice. The road so slick it felt like driving across a frozen river. He passed abandoned cars half buried near the shoulder, their owners having decided walking was safer than trusting machines. The sky hung low and heavy, the color of dirty wool. When he reached Sarah Caldwell's general store, he found the parking lot crowded in a way that made his stomach tighten. People moved quickly, shoulders hunched, faces tense, their voices clipped. The bell above the door rang again and again, frantic as a heartbeat. Inside, the warmth was weak compared to the cold outside, but it felt like stepping into a different world, one that still pretended it could be normal. Shelves that had been full a week ago were already thinning. Canned goods were stacked like gold. Bread was nearly gone. Frank saw Sarah behind the counter, her chestnut hair pulled back, cheeks flushed, freckles bright against her pale skin. She looked tired in a way that wasn't just physical. Her hazel eyes kept scanning the room, tracking the mood like a weather report. She was tall and lean, but today she seemed even narrower, as if the stress was carving her down. She managed a smile for customers, but it was the kind of smile that existed to prevent panic, not to express joy. Frank stepped forward with a bag of feed and a few essentials. Sarah noticed him and lifted her chin in greeting. "You picked a fine week to become popular," she said quietly, leaning closer so only he could hear. Frank glanced around. A man argued near the canned soup. A woman clutched a sack of rice like it was a child. "Supply trucks?" Frank asked. Sarah's expression tightened. "Not coming. Roads are iced over past the ridge. State says they'll try to clear it, but—" She shrugged slightly, and the shrug was honest. "We've heard that before." Frank paid, and as he turned, he caught sight of Tom Briggs near the back. Tom looked different without his usual smugness. His thick neck was tense, his patchy beard untrimmed, and his eyes darted toward the shelves with something close to worry. He wasn't laughing today. He was counting. That was what Cole did. It turned jokers into accountants. A new face appeared beside Tom. Deputy Mark Harlan. Mark was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered and tall, wearing a heavy uniform jacket with a fur-lined collar. His hair was dark blonde, cropped short, and his face had the blunt sturdiness of someone who'd been in a few fights and didn't always win. A scar ran along the edge of his jawline, faint but visible, like a signature left by some old mistake. His eyes were gray and sharp, the kind that missed very little. He carried himself with the tired authority of a man who'd spent too many nights knocking on doors with bad news. Frank didn't know him well, but he'd seen him around helping stranded drivers, breaking up minor fights, doing the quiet work that kept small towns from tearing themselves apart. Mark's voice cut through the store's noise. "Everyone needs to calm down," he said, not shouting, but firm enough to be heard. "There's enough to go around if people don't act like wolves." Tom muttered something under his breath. Frank caught a piece of it, something about wolves being the only ones who survived. Mark shot Tom a look that could have frozen water. "Say that again," Mark said softly. Tom held up his hands. "I'm just saying people got families." Mark's jaw tightened. "So does everyone else." Frank watched them, feeling the tension coil in the air. This was how winter started breaking a town, not with dramatic collapse, but with small fractures. People became suspicious. They became territorial. Hunger didn't just empty stomachs, it hollowed out kindness. Frank left before the argument could grow teeth. Outside, the wind hit him again, and the cold felt even harsher after the brief warmth of the store. He drove back toward his cabin, passing houses with smoke rising thinly from chimneys. Some families had already started rationing wood, letting their fires die down to conserve fuel. Others burned too much, too fast, because fear made people wasteful. Frank had seen it before in different forms: panic spending, panic eating, panic living. Fear always demanded payment up front. When he returned home, he found Shadow standing near the greenhouse door, whining softly. The dog's paws scraped at the snow, as if urging Frank to hurry. Frank's heart gave a strange jump. "What is it?" he murmured, moving quickly despite his aching joints. He opened the greenhouse door and stepped inside. At first, he saw nothing but dark soil and faint condensation on the panels. Then his eyes adjusted. In the seed beds, tiny green threads had begun to rise, so small they were almost imaginary, but unmistakably alive. Frank crouched slowly, as if sudden movement might scare the plants back into the earth. His breath caught. It wasn't just that they had sprouted. It was that they had sprouted now, in this cold, in this cruelty, as if life itself was refusing to be bullied. Frank reached out with a gloved finger and hovered above the fragile shoots, not touching, just witnessing. He felt something swell in his chest, something that bordered on grief and joy at the same time. It reminded him of holding his son as a baby, that impossible smallness, that helpless strength. Shadow stepped closer and sniffed the air, then looked at Frank with bright, alert eyes. The dog wagged his tail once, slow and certain, as if he understood the significance. Frank let out a rough laugh, the sound surprising even him. "You see that?" he whispered. "You see what we did?" The greenhouse was still cold, but it held a different kind of warmth now, hope, fragile but real. Frank knew the plants would need care. He would have to manage moisture, protect them from freezing at night, maybe add extra insulation along the base. He had no electricity running out here, no fancy heaters, just his mind, his hands, and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. He placed more stones along the beds and hung an old dark blanket over part of the greenhouse wall to reduce heat loss. It was crude, but Frank wasn't building luxury. He was building survival. As the days passed, the cold tightened its grip. The town became quieter. Fewer cars moved. Fewer lights stayed on at night. People began to speak in smaller voices, as if loud sound might attract misfortune. Sarah's store rationed certain items. Mark Harlan drove up and down the streets, checking on older residents, his expression growing more strained with each passing hour. Tom Briggs stopped making jokes entirely. Frank saw him once outside his shop, staring at the sky like a man trying to bargain with it. One afternoon, Sarah came to Frank's cabin. She didn't call first. In a town like this, you didn't always call. You just showed up when something mattered. She stood on his porch, her coat dusted with snow, cheeks pink from cold. Her hair had escaped its knot again, strands framing her face. She looked exhausted, but there was determination in her eyes. "I heard you've got something growing," she said, not accusing, not begging, just stating what the wind had already carried to her. Frank hesitated. He didn't like secrets. He didn't like attention. But he also didn't like watching people suffer, when he had a way to help. A little, he admitted. Sarah exhaled, relief and disbelief mixed together. Frank, people are starting to get scared. Real scared. Frank looked past her at the gray horizon. I know. She lowered her voice. There's a family down the road, young couple, 2 kids. Their pantry's almost empty. The kids have been coughing. No fresh food in days. Frank felt his stomach tighten. Fresh food. It wasn't just comfort. It was strength. It was health. How far? He asked. 2 miles, Sarah said. They're trying to stretch what they have, but she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Frank could hear the rest in the way her voice strained. Frank nodded once, slow. Let me see what I can do. That night, Frank sat at his small kitchen table, staring at his hands. The fire crackled low. Shadow lay beside him, head on his paws, watching Frank with quiet patience. Frank thought about the sprouts in the greenhouse, still small, still delicate. He thought about the town, about the laughter that had turned into nervous silence. He thought about how winter always forced choices: hoard or share, hide or help, survive alone or survive together. He stood, pulled on his flannel jacket, and stepped outside into the bitter night. The sky was black and heavy, the stars hidden behind storm clouds. Frank walked to the greenhouse, opened the door, and breathed in the faint, earthy smell of life pushing upward. He knelt beside the beds and looked at the fragile green shoots again. They trembled slightly in the cold air, but they were there. They were real. Frank didn't speak. He didn't make a speech to the universe. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out another handful of seeds, and began planting more. Because if the town was going to get hungry, then Frank was going to answer with growth. Quietly. Stubbornly. Like a man refusing to let winter have the last word. That afternoon, the snow came down so thick, the sky looked like it was collapsing, as if the world had finally decided to bury the town and be done with it. Wind drove the flakes sideways, and the trees bent under the weight like old men bowing to a ruthless king. Frank Miller had been inside the greenhouse for most of the day, moving with slow patience between the narrow beds, checking the moisture with his fingertips, adjusting the blanket he'd hung along the wall to trap what little heat the weak winter sun offered. The sprouts were no longer just threads. They had become small leaves, trembling but stubborn, their green color almost offensive against the endless white outside. Frank stared at them sometimes longer than he needed to, not because he was admiring his work, but because the sight of life in a dead season did something to his mind. It softened the hard edges. It reminded him he hadn't entirely turned to stone. Shadow stayed near the greenhouse door, alert, watching the yard like a sentry. The German shepherd's thick black and tan coat had gathered tiny ice crystals along his back from running through the drifting snow, and when he shook himself, it sounded like someone sprinkling gravel. His eyes followed every movement beyond the property line. He wasn't anxious, exactly. He was attentive in that serious way loyal dogs become when they sense their person is carrying something precious. Frank had just stepped out of the greenhouse, wiping his hands on his jeans, when Shadow's posture changed. The dog's ears snapped forward. His body stiffened. He let out one low, warning huff, not a bark meant to threaten, but a sound that said, "Someone is here." Frank looked toward the driveway, squinting through the white curtain of falling snow. At first, he saw only the shifting blur of storm and shadow. Then shapes emerged, People, bundled in coats and scarves, moving slowly as if the wind itself was pushing them back. Frank's first instinct was irritation. Not anger, just that old reflex of wanting to be left alone. He had built his life out here specifically to escape other people's needs and opinions. But then he noticed the way they walked. Not like tourists or curious neighbors. Like the cold had already begun eating them from the inside. Like they were coming not to gossip, but to survive. They stopped at the edge of his porch, hesitating as if the wooden steps were a boundary between pride and desperation. There were 4 of them. A young couple Frank recognized vaguely from town, and an older woman with a hunched posture, plus a teenage boy who looked too thin for the winter coat he wore. The woman's cheeks were red and cracked from cold, her gray hair tucked under a knitted hat, and her eyes carried that exhausted glaze of someone who had spent too many nights worrying. The young man, late 20s maybe, had a narrow face and a patchy beard that made him look older than he was. His nose was pink from windburn, and his lips were pale, like he'd been biting them to keep from trembling. The young woman beside him held a small child against her chest, wrapped in a blanket so thick the kid looked like a bundled loaf of bread. Her hair was dark blonde, braided and tucked into her scarf, and her eyes were wide, not with fear exactly, but with that strained politeness people wear when they're asking for something they don't want to ask for. The teenage boy stood slightly behind them, shoulders hunched, hands stuffed deep into his pockets. His hair was black and messy beneath his hood, and his expression tried to be tough, but his eyes kept darting toward the cabin door like he expected to be turned away. Frank noticed his knuckles raw and red, likely from shoveling or chopping, or simply fighting the cold without gloves that fit. Shadow walked forward first, silent, tail low but not tucked, sniffing the air around them. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply looked at them with the calm seriousness of a judge in fur. The child's small hand reached out toward the dog's muzzle, and Shadow leaned in gently, letting the kid touch him. That single motion soft, trusting cut through the tension like a warm knife through frozen butter. Frank felt something shift inside him. The young man cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller?" he asked. His voice cracked slightly, and he hated himself for it. Frank could tell. "I'm Ethan Rowe. We live down on Maple Bend." Frank nodded once. He didn't invite them in yet. He just waited. Ethan swallowed. "Sarah said you might. She said you might have something growing." Frank looked at the older woman. "And you are?" he asked. The woman lifted her chin with effort. "June Halverson," she said. Her voice was raspy but firm, like a woman who'd raised children and buried a husband and refused to be pitied. "I'm not here to beg. I'm here because my pantry is empty and my hands don't work like they used to." Frank's eyes flicked to her fingers. They were swollen at the joints, stiff, likely arthritis made worse by cold. She held them close to her body, as if trying to protect them from the wind. The young woman adjusted the child in her arms. "I'm Lila," she said softly. Her cheeks were damp, not from snow, but from tears she hadn't wiped away. "This is Noah." The child's face peeked out from the blanket-round cheeks, watery eyes, a small nose running from cold. He looked no older than 4. His lips were slightly bluish at the edges, and Frank felt a cold anger rise in him, not at them, but at the world that let children suffer while adults argued over soup cans. Frank stood there for a long moment, listening to the storm. He could have shut the door. He could have said he had nothing. He could have protected his own small miracle and let the town deal with its own consequences. Part of him wanted to. Not because he was cruel, but because he was tired. Tired of being the one who had to hold things together. Tired of giving and never getting back. Tired of caring. But then Shadow sat down at Frank's feet, calm and steady, looking up at him as if reminding him who he was when he wasn't hiding. Frank exhaled slowly, a breath that felt like surrender and decision at the same time. "Come inside," Frank said. They hesitated, almost shocked by the invitation. Ethan moved first, stepping onto the porch with careful respect. June followed, her boots scraping snow off the steps. Lila came last, clutching Noah close. The teenage boy lingered at the edge, uncertain. Frank looked at him. "You too," Frank said, not unkindly. The boy nodded once and stepped up, trying to look like he didn't care. But his eyes softened slightly, like someone who'd been bracing for rejection and didn't know what to do with acceptance. Inside the cabin, warmth wrapped around them, thin but real. The fire in the stove crackled, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air like a memory. Frank watched their faces change as the heat touched them. June's shoulders lowered slightly. Ethan blinked rapidly, as if his eyes were stinging from more than cold. Lila's grip on Noah loosened just a little, and the child's breathing steadied. Frank didn't offer speeches. He poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove. He handed them mugs, and the simple act of holding something warm made their hands look less like claws and more like human hands again. Shadow circled them once, then lay down near the door, satisfied, as if he'd decided they were not enemies. After a few minutes, Frank opened the cabin door again. "Stay here," he said, and stepped back outside into the storm. The snow hit him immediately, fierce and stinging. He pulled his flannel jacket tighter, the red and black pattern bright against the white world, and trudged to the greenhouse. The structure stood firm, panels rattling slightly in the wind, but holding. Frank opened the door and stepped inside. The air was damp, earthy, alive. The small leaves trembled under the faint warmth trapped inside, and Frank felt a strange tenderness rise in him. He had built this with his own hands, yes, but it didn't feel like it belonged to him alone anymore. It felt like something the season had allowed him to borrow, and now he had to decide what kind of man he wanted to be with that borrowed gift. He knelt beside the beds and examined the greens. They weren't fully mature, but there was enough. Enough for soup. Enough for a taste of freshness that might remind people they weren't just surviving, they were still living. Frank took a small knife from his pocket and began cutting carefully, his movements gentle, almost reverent. The leaves were cold against his gloves, but their color was so vivid it looked unreal, like a trick of light. He gathered them into bundles, the green bright as emerald against his dark sleeves. As he worked, he thought about laughter. He thought about Tom Briggs and the others who had mocked him. He thought about how easy it was to laugh at something until you needed it. The irony tasted bitter, but Frank forced himself not to dwell on it. Resentment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Winter didn't give extra calories for grudges. When he returned to the cabin, the sight of the greens in his hands made the room go silent. Ethan stared as if Frank had brought in a piece of summer stolen from God. Lila's mouth opened slightly, and for a second, she looked like she might laugh or cry, not knowing which emotion fit. June blinked hard, her eyes suddenly wet, and she looked away quickly, ashamed of tears. Noah pointed. "Leaves," the child whispered, as if saying the word too loud might break the magic. Frank set the bundles on the table. "Wash them," he said simply. "Make soup. Eat them raw if you have to, but don't waste them." Ethan's hands trembled as he reached forward. How did you do this?" he asked. Frank shrugged, though the gesture carried weight. "Same way you do anything in winter," he said. "You prepare. You protect. You don't quit." The teenage boy, who had been silent, finally spoke. His voice was low, guarded. "People said you were crazy." Frank looked at him, meeting his eyes. "People say a lot of things," Frank replied. "Most of it's just noise." The boy nodded slowly, absorbing that like a lesson he'd been waiting for. Frank realized then that this wasn't just about food. It was about dignity, about showing people, especially the young, that the world could be cruel and still be answered with effort instead of surrender. A knock sounded at the door again, sudden and sharp. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked. Frank's stomach tightened. He hadn't expected more so soon. He walked to the door and opened it. Deputy Mark Harlan stood on the porch, snow collecting on his shoulders, his fur-lined collar dusted white. His gray eyes flicked past Frank into the cabin, catching sight of the people inside and the bundles of greens on the table. Mark's expression didn't soften into surprise, but something in his face shifted, like a man seeing a rope thrown into floodwater. "Frank," Mark said, voice controlled, "I need to talk to you." Frank stepped outside, closing the door behind him to keep the warmth in. "What is it?" he asked. Mark's jaw tightened, and the scar along it looked sharper in the cold. "Town's getting desperate," he said. "There's been arguing, threats. I heard you've got something." His gaze flicked toward the greenhouse. "If word spreads, people are going to come. Not all of them polite." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "You here to stop me?" Mark shook his head. "I'm here to warn you." His voice lowered. "You can't feed everyone alone, but you also can't pretend this won't become the center of attention." Frank looked out into the storm, seeing nothing but white and movement. He felt the weight of the moment settle on him like snow on a roof. The town's laughter had turned into need, and need, he knew, could become ugly when it grew hungry. "I'm not hiding it," Frank said finally, "but I'm not letting it turn into chaos either." Mark studied him, then nodded once. "If you decide to help more people," Mark said, "do it smart, do it controlled, or the cold won't be the only thing that kills someone." Frank didn't answer immediately. He thought of the greens on his table. He thought of Noah's small hand touching Shadow's muzzle. He thought of June's pride fighting her hunger. He thought of the town, cracking under pressure like ice. "I'll handle it," Frank said quietly. Mark held his gaze for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the storm. Frank went back inside. Ethan and Lila were already bundling the greens carefully, treating them like treasure. June stood near the stove, warming her hands, eyes fixed on the fire, as if it was the only honest thing left in the world. The teenage boy looked at Frank with something new in his expression, respect, mixed with confusion, as if he couldn't understand why someone would give away the only miracle they had. Frank didn't explain. He simply poured hot water into another mug and set it in front of June. Then he looked down at Shadow, who had risen and stood beside him again, steady as a shadow of loyalty. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside Frank's cabin, the first green bundles of winter had been cut, and the town had begun to learn a new sound, one that wasn't laughter anymore. It was the sound of knocking, and behind it, the sound of people remembering they were human. By the next morning, the story had already traveled farther than Frank Miller ever could. In a small town, news didn't move like a letter carried by hand. It moved like smoke, slipping through cracks, curling under doors, finding every room where people sat with worry and hunger. The wind carried it too, not in words, but in the way neighbors suddenly looked at each other differently, the way conversations stopped when someone walked by, the way a rumor became a fact simply because everyone needed it to be true. Frank had cut a handful of greens, and somehow the town heard it as a miracle. They didn't talk about seedlings or soil or stones holding heat. They talked about salvation. They talked about the veteran with the stubborn jacket and the dog that guarded the door like a saint with teeth. Frank didn't sleep much. He sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee gone cold, listening to the storm slap the windows, thinking about Deputy Mark Harlan's warning. Frank knew crowds, not the cheerful kind at fairs and parades, but the desperate kind, the kind that formed when fear got hungry. He had seen men turn mean over less. He had seen good people become selfish when the world squeezed them hard enough. The idea of strangers swarming his yard, demanding what he didn't have, made his stomach tighten. But the idea of turning them away made something else tighten too. Something deeper. Something that felt like shame. Frank had lived long enough to know shame was worse than cold. Cold could kill your body. Shame killed the part of you that wanted to keep living. Shadow sensed his restlessness. The German shepherd paced once, then sat beside Frank's chair, leaning his weight against Frank's leg with quiet insistence. The dog's warmth grounded him, like a living reminder that loyalty was not a theory. Frank scratched behind Shadow's ear and felt the dog's tail thump once, steady as a heartbeat. "Yeah," Frank murmured, voice rough. "I know. We'll do it smart." He stepped outside before sunrise, the world still dark and blue, the snow reflecting faint moonlight like a sheet of steel. The greenhouse stood there beside the cabin, its panels frosted, its door rimmed with ice. Frank opened it and stepped inside, breathing in the damp, earthy smell that now felt like the scent of defiance. The greens had grown a little more, though, their leaves wider, stronger, though still tender. Frank checked the soil, adjusted the insulation along the base, and then did something he hadn't planned at first. He began preparing seed packets. He didn't have fancy envelopes. He used folded paper and old jars, labeling them with a carpenter's pencil. Kale, spinach, arugula. He counted what he could spare, because he knew the real miracle wasn't feeding everyone from one greenhouse. The real miracle would be teaching them how to build their own. The first knock came just after dawn, sharp and hesitant. Shadow's ears snapped up, but he didn't bark. He simply walked to the door and waited, as if he understood the difference between a threat and a plea. Frank opened it and found Sarah Caldwell standing on his porch, snow dusting her coat and cap. She looked even more tired than yesterday, her hazel eyes rimmed faintly red, as if she hadn't slept either. Her chestnut hair was tucked under her hat, but a few strands had escaped, curling against her cheek like stubborn little questions. "You're awake early," Frank said. Sarah gave him a thin smile. "So is everyone else." She glanced past him toward the greenhouse. "It's spreading, Frank. The story. People are talking like you've got a farm in there." Frank snorted softly. "I've got a few beds of greens and a lot of cold." Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I tried to keep it quiet, but you know how it is. People heard about Noah. They heard about June. They heard you gave food away. Her expression softened. They're scared. And when people are scared, they either become grateful or they become ugly. Frank nodded. Mark warned me. Sarah's eyes flicked to Shadow, who stood beside Frank like a silent guard. What are you going to do? Frank looked out at the yard, at the snow piled high, at the storm still rolling its shoulders across the sky. I'm not feeding the town, he said. I'm teaching them. Sarah blinked, surprised. Then she exhaled, relief and admiration mixed together, though she didn't say either word. That's smarter than what most people would do, she admitted. But you'll need help. Frank's instinct was to refuse. Help came with obligation, and obligation was the rope he'd spent years ensemble cutting himself free from. But then he remembered the child's pale lips, the older woman's swollen fingers, the teenager's guarded eyes. Pride was heavy, and Frank was too old to carry it everywhere. All right, Frank said. Help me keep it orderly. Sarah nodded once, decisive. I'll handle the talking, she said. You handle the growing. It was a fair deal. Frank hated talking. Sarah was built for it, even when she didn't want to be. She had that steady presence people listened to, the kind of voice that could calm a room without begging for silence. By mid-morning, the knocking began in earnest. One family at first, then another. People came in small groups, bundled in coats, faces raw from cold, eyes darting with that same mixture of hope and embarrassment. Frank watched them through the cabin window, feeling the pressure build like storm clouds. He kept his door closed until Sarah stepped outside and raised a hand, stopping them with the authority of a schoolteacher and the patience of a woman who'd seen too much hardship to waste time on drama. Listen, Sarah called, her voice carrying over the wind. Frank's not a grocery store. You're not here to take. You're here to learn, one group at a time. A man near the back muttered something bitter. Frank recognized him, Caleb Dunn, a broad-shouldered logger in his 40s, with a thick reddish beard and a face weathered like old leather. Caleb had the kind of presence that filled space, the kind of man who rarely asked for anything because he was used to taking. His eyes were dark and restless, and his hands were huge, scarred from years of work. Frank had seen him at the store before, laughing loud, talking louder. Now his laughter was gone, replaced by a sharp impatience that made Frank wary. We're freezing out here, Caleb said, voice rough as gravel. People got kids. Sarah didn't flinch. So do we, she replied. Wait your turn or go home. Caleb's jaw clenched. For a moment, Frank thought the man might push forward anyway. But then Deputy Mark Harlan's truck rolled up, tires crunching over ice, and Mark stepped out, his broad frame cutting through the snow like a moving wall. Mark's gray eyes locked onto Caleb, and Caleb's posture shifted, still defiant, but less reckless. Authority mattered in hunger. Fear recognized uniforms. Mark walked up beside Sarah, his breath visible in the cold air. Everyone stays calm, he said, voice firm. No pushing, no threats. If you can't behave, you leave. Caleb spat into the snow, muttering, but he stepped back. The crowd quieted. Frank watched from inside, feeling the strange tension of being both the center of attention and a man who wanted to disappear. Shadow stood at Frank's side, ears alert, ready. Frank opened the door and stepped out. The cold hit him hard, but he didn't waver. He wore his buffalo plaid jacket like a flag of stubbornness, his face set, his pale blue eyes steady. The crowd looked at him with expressions that shifted like weather hope, shame, curiosity, desperation. Some of them had laughed at him days ago. Frank saw it in their eyes. They didn't know whether to apologize or pretend they hadn't been cruel. Frank didn't give them the satisfaction of watching him react. He raised his voice just enough to be heard. "I've got seeds," he said. "I've got advice. I've got a greenhouse that works because I built it to fight wind and hold heat. What I don't have is enough food to feed everyone. So if you came here to take, you're wasting your time. If you came here to learn, step forward." Silence held for a moment, heavy as snow on branches. Then an older man stepped forward, hesitant. His name was Walter Finch, and Frank knew him only by reputation. A retired teacher, thin and stooped, with a bald head and a gray mustache that made him look like he belonged in an old photograph. Walter's hands shook slightly from age, but his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and humbled. "I came to learn," Walter said quietly. "If you'll have me." Frank nodded. "Good." One by one, others followed. A young woman with a baby, a middle-aged couple, a teenager who kept his eyes down. Even Tom Briggs appeared at the edge of the group, standing half behind his truck like he hoped no one would notice him. Tom's face was pale from cold, and his usual grin was gone. He looked smaller without his jokes. When Frank's eyes found him, Tom hesitated, then stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Frank," Tom said, voice rough. I was wrong." The words seemed to hurt him, like swallowing glass. "Didn't think it could work." Frank stared at him for a long moment. The old Frank, the younger, angrier one, might have enjoyed that apology, might have used it as proof, but the man Frank was now understood something bitter and simple. Winter didn't care who was right. Winter only cared who survived. Frank nodded once. "You got a place to build?" he asked. Tom blinked. "Yeah." "Then I'll show you how to start," Frank said. Tom's shoulders sagged with relief, and for a second, he looked like a man who had been drowning and just found air. Frank spent the next hours doing what he did best, working with his hands and explaining without poetry. He showed them how to choose a spot sheltered from wind, how to angle panels to catch light, how to insulate the base with packed snow and scrap wood, how to use stones to hold heat. He talked about moisture, about mold, about not overwatering when the air was cold. He spoke with the blunt practicality of a man who didn't believe in fantasies. People listened as if he were reading them a map out of hell. Sarah moved among them like a quiet conductor, organizing groups, calming tempers, handing out small seed packets Frank had prepared. Mark stayed nearby, watching Caleb Dunn and others who looked like they might cause trouble if desperation sharpened further. Shadow wandered between boots and legs, occasionally leaning against someone's knee, reminding them with his calm presence that this place was protected by more than wood and plastic. By late afternoon, the storm eased slightly, and a weak sun pushed through the clouds like a tired eye opening. The greenhouse panels caught that light, turning gold for a moment, glowing like a lantern in the snow. Frank stood back and watched the crowd disperse, seed packets in pockets, instructions in their heads, hope in their shoulders. Some people thanked him. Some couldn't speak, their throats tight with emotion. Some just nodded and left, pride still clinging to them like frost. Frank didn't need their gratitude. He needed them to do the work. As the last group left, June Halverson returned, walking carefully with her stiff hands tucked into her coat. She stopped in front of Frank and held out a small jar. Inside were a few dried beans. "It's not much," she said, voice raspy. Oh, but it's what I've got. Payment. Frank shook his head. Keep it. June's eyes narrowed. Don't insult me, boy, she snapped, and the word boy sounded almost funny coming from her. Then her expression softened, and she lowered the jar slightly. Fine, she said. Then take it as a promise. When I can, I'll give back. Frank accepted the jar, not because he needed beans, but because he understood what she was really offering. Dignity. He nodded once. All right, he said. Deal. That night, Frank sat by his stove, exhaustion heavy in his bones, but something in his chest felt lighter than it had in years. Shadow lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes half closed. Outside, the town was still trapped in winter's grip. Roads were still frozen. Supplies were still scarce. But now, scattered across yards and porches and backlots, people were beginning to build their own small chambers of hope. Not because winter had become kind, but because they had finally remembered how to be stubborn together. Frank looked at the greenhouse through the window, its faint inner darkness holding the memory of green. He realized then that the warmest thing in the world wasn't fire. Fire burned fast and demanded constant feeding. The warmest thing was persistence, quiet, relentless, and the kind of kindness that didn't announce itself, but simply showed up when the knocking started. In the end, the town didn't survive because the storm got weaker. It survived because hearts got stronger. And maybe that's the real miracle, because God doesn't always send angels with wings. Sometimes he sends a stubborn old veteran in a red and black flannel jacket, a loyal dog who refuses to leave his side, and a little greenhouse glowing like a lantern in the snow. Because when winter tries to take everything, God often leaves one small door unlocked. A door called faith, persistence, and kindness. A single seed. A single warm hand. A single come inside spoken at the right moment. And somehow, that becomes enough to carry an entire town through the darkest days. So if you're watching this and life feels cold right now, if you're tired, if you're lonely, if you feel like you're running out of strength, remember this: miracles don't always arrive loud. Sometimes they grow quietly, one day at a time, right in the middle of your struggle. If this story touched your heart, take a second to share it with someone who needs hope today. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from and what you're fighting through in your own life, because you never know who might read your words and feel less alone. And don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. May God bless you, protect your home, and fill your days with warmth no matter how hard the season gets. And may He guide your steps, strengthen your heart, and keep hope growing in your life. Just like green leaves rising through the snow. Amen.